So, what's going on? Why does schizophrenia occur? Well, as usual, we'll go through some of the different viewpoints, the different theoretical perspectives that help us understand at least some of what is going on with schizophrenia. One of the primary viewpoints with not only this disorder, but many of our disorders, is the biological one. What's going on in the body and in the brain that causes this disorder to occur? Um, Schizophrenia is highly heritable, has a heritability score of something like 76%, meaning that the more closely related you are to someone who has schizophrenia, the higher your risk for developing that disorder. That indicates, genetic factors that make it more likely for you to develop this disorder. Um, One of the primary ways that we think and talk about that genetic predisposition is using the diathesis stress model, which says that it's not, you have a genetic predisposition, you've got some genetic marker that makes it more likely that you'll develop that disorder, but that then has to be activated, triggered in some way by stressful events. So this is what we call diathesis stress. Um, and that's one of the primary ways that we think about the development of schizophrenia now, is that it's not just that you are predisposed toward it, but then what happened that made that predisposition turn into an active disorder. As we look at what's going on in the brain, we've discovered that there are unusual kinds of activations with dopamine receptors in folks suffering from schizophrenia, where there's a particular type of dopamine receptor called the D2 receptor that appears to be overactive. So it's sending its message too frequently, too strongly in the brain. And we've discovered that through the use of antipsychotic medications like thorazine and many others that are commonly used to treat schizophrenia. What those medications do actually is reduce the effectiveness and the action of dopamine in the brain. And so the fact that that works and helps folks who are experiencing schizophrenic symptoms, so that they have fewer delusions and fewer hallucinations and less disordered speech and thinking, that indicates that that is part of what is going on. Um, Now, there may be other neurotransmitters that are involved beyond just dopamine, but that's the one that's gotten the most study. Newer research has focused not just on the action of dopamine, but on uh, activation circuits in the brain. So collections of neurons that are linked together, and those are the ones that get overactivated. So there is a circuit that includes the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus, the amygdala, the thalamus, striatum, substantia nigra, um, that those appear to be the neurons that are becoming overactivated and that are sending too high of dopamine signals, and that appears to be what's causing the problems. Now, some of the newest research says that those structures there's actually two different subcircuits, right? And that it is the connection between the substantia nigra and the striatum, deep brain structures, that is responsible for a lot of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, and its connections between the hippocampus and amygdala that are responsible for some of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So we're continuing to sort of refine our ideas about what's going on in the brain as we discover a little bit more about it, and we've got better tools to figure out what's happening in the brain. There's also been some interesting research that shows that exposure to viruses when in utero can make somebody more carries a higher risk of developing schizophrenia later in life. Not because they have an immune response themselves, excuse me, but rather that it is a passed on immune response from the mother that then causes some changes in the brain development of the fetus. And there's been animal work that's shown some of this, as well as real life linkages, correlations between when people are born. Folks who are born in winter tend to have higher rates of schizophrenia, and also those whose moms were exposed to influenza while they were in utero. Both of those are associated with higher schizophrenia risk. Um, in conjunction with this idea, they found that people with schizophrenia have more active microglia, which are brain immune cells that protect against brain infections. So this is sort of an overgeneralization or a hypervigilant response of these cells that then causes differences in brain function that then can lead to some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. So once again, we're still sort of figuring out what's going on there, but some encouraging work that hopefully will let us know at some point exactly what's happening. Now, if you're going to look at it from other perspectives, let's go through some of these. You've got the psychodynamic perspective, the Freudian perspective. There was some work during the earlier part of the 20th century, 1930s, I want to say, that blamed the occurrence of schizophrenia on what they called schizophrenogenic mothers, which was a combination of an overbearing critical mother who also had let's see, she was overbearing and critical, but also distant, right? So there was from Reichman, who said that was what caused schizophrenia. So as the child grew, the way that they learned to navigate these unstable, difficult relationships was through the enactment of or creation of schizophrenic behaviors. They're really, so that there were several studies early on that showed that, but then later work disputed and sort of disproved it, because there's overbearing distant mothers all over the place. Well, I don't know if all over the place, but there didn't appear to be any difference based on later work, any difference in the occurrence of having an overbearing and distant mother between those who developed schizophrenia and those who didn't, meaning that is unlikely to be the cause of it. More current work in the psychodynamic realm has talked about the influence of biological factors, right? If you've got some brain differences that are then causing you to think differently and perceive differently, that can then lead to the development of a fragmented self. And since psychodynamics is all about the action of the self, the different parts of the self, the id, ego, superego, they're really interested in how that then shows up in disordered behavior. If you look at the cognitive behavioral viewpoint, there was some work at one point that suggested that operant conditioning was involved in the development of schizophrenic behavior, meaning that people acting out strangely, presenting with delusions or hallucinations, were then positively reinforced for that behavior, and so then enacted it again. Got more attention, received more of what they needed, but the support for that seemed to be limited at best, and so that can really only be seen as a partial explanation for why this might occur. And then if you want to talk about on the cognitive end of it, obviously you're dealing with perceptions, unusual perceptions and interpretations of the stimuli that's coming in through the brain. And so there's been a little bit of work done there, but honestly, that viewpoint doesn't have a ton to say, or doesn't give us a ton of information on how to move forward with schizophrenia. Now, the sociocultural view looks at cultural and interactive factors. So first of all, it's worth looking at the different rates at which this is diagnosed. You do have higher rates of diagnosis amongst African Americans than amongst white Americans. And I'm of a mind that is pretty much well explained by socioeconomic differences and the unfortunate fact that Black folks are more likely to be on the lower end of the SES spectrum in our society, and some of the, I mean, we're having a national conversation about that right now with people out protesting and talking about some of the systemic disadvantages that black folks experience in our country, that, as I talked about earlier, if you've got a genetic predisposition towards the development of schizophrenia, if you are under higher levels of stress, as low SES folks necessarily are, you're then more likely to develop the disorder. Um, so I think that's a more likely explanation than there being some um, genetic difference amongst black folks here in the United States. Um, Although we haven't yet ruled that out entirely, right? Um, Now, interestingly, there are differences in not only the rate of schizophrenic diagnosis, but also how the disorder progresses, depending on where you are in the world. And this is a pretty unique. Take a minute to look at this chart here, this figure, because it's pretty unusual in that it shows that people from developing countries, those with fewer resources, less wealth, actually tend to have fewer negative symptoms when they experience schizophrenia. No, let me rephrase that. I don't mean negative symptoms. I mean tend to have fewer problems, less troubling symptoms when they experience schizophrenia, and they tend to go into complete remission nearly twice as frequently. So there's something going on in terms of the industrial development of the world, and how we do things in developed countries that is not helping us out when it comes to the treatment of schizophrenia, because folks are actually getting better in places where there are fewer resources more frequently, and they're not having as much trouble with this particular disorder. Now, this is really unusual, right? Most of our other disorders, you get better outcomes the more wealthy and the more resources there are in a particular place. Not so with schizophrenia. And honestly, we don't understand exactly what's going on there, but it's worth recognizing that there's more to be understood here. Other things that help us understand schizophrenia, social labeling is an interesting one. Um, if you've got somebody who is labeled as schizophrenic, who receives that diagnosis, their behavior then becomes viewed through the lens of schizophrenia. So you get behavior that might not necessarily be thought of as disordered in the average individual that then gets attributed to their disorder once the person is known to be schizophrenic. Um, you go back to an old study from the 70s, a guy named Rosenhan. Uh, he and a bunch of other people working with him actually got themselves admitted into mental hospitals. They lied and said that they were having auditory hallucinations. All got admitted into um, psychiatric institutions on the basis of that single report, and then were instructed to be model citizens while in these institutions, meaning I'm taking my medication, although they would take it and then throw it away instead of actually consuming it. Um, they participated in group therapies. They were behaved themselves, were compliant, and were to report having no more symptoms from that very first time, right? So they got it. Hey, I'm having these auditory hallucinations. I'm hearing this hollow, empty thud in my head, and it's really disturbing me. Okay, we'll admit you into our psychiatric ward, and then from the very next day say, hey, I'm fine. I'm feeling better. I'm not having any trouble. The average length of stay for these individuals was nearly 3 weeks. The longest was actually 52 days, if I remember right, before they let the person leave. Um, and when they looked over the notes that had been made by the caregivers, frequently the behavior that they were engaging in, which was normal behavior, they were specifically trying to act normal, and they were not people with schizophrenia, got interpreted as disordered behavior by their doctors and the orderlies that were helping them. So that sort of speaks to the social labeling of behavior. And other things to think about is the function of the family. Interestingly, folks with schizophrenia who live with their families are four times more likely to relapse and experience further schizophrenic episodes than those who do not. Family stress, the family dynamics, if they are highly stressful, lead to the development of schizophrenia. And so someone who is then continuing to be exposed to this stressful situation because the family functioning was probably stressful to begin with, or they probably wouldn't have developed schizophrenia, then have a harder time recovering. Um, and as we said, we are what we're most interested in is understanding how this develops and how this changes over time, so that folks can get better. And the most useful way to look at it, as I mentioned earlier, is the diathesis stress model, which integrates genetic predispositions within exposure to stress, whatever that may be, whether it's a divorce or the death of a loved one, or you've got a dysfunctional family, or other sorts of environmental factors that then lead to the development of the disorder. Now, if you can deal with those stressors, then it is far more likely that the person is then going to be able to recover and move out of the diagnostic realm, right, and back into normal functioning, which is what we want people to be able to do.